A few years ago, my doctor told me I needed to do something about the excess weight I was carrying. She said it wasn't good for my heart, especially since heart disease ran in my family. I told her that stressing over it wasn't good for my heart either. She told me to stop being a cavalier smartass and to do something about it. She also told me it wasn't good for business or her bank account if her patients died off young. Now, I was only 29, and I was carrying an extra 100 pounds, give or take 10. I knew something had to be done. Quite honestly, I was just too lazy to do it. If I was exercising, I couldn't be in front of the computer or the TV or taking a nap and feeling good. So, she laid out a plan, which I thought was too tedious and too much of a change for me to stick to. She wanted me to start counting calories and cut out jelly donuts, biscuits, and gravy, with the extra side of sausage, red meat, pork, and at least half of my white bread intake. And don't even get me started on the exercise routine she recommended. With the extra 100 pounds, did she really think I'd be able to run a mile 3 times a week? Dad used to say that I wouldn't run if someone set my heels on fire. Counting calories? Who has time to count the calories in all their food? Not me. So we discussed the routine I would attempt until she was so upset that she threw her hands up. I thought I compromised quite well. I agreed to cut out the jelly donuts for 3 months, cut down on the bread, leave off the extra side of sausage, and walk a mile 3 times a week. For someone who had been sedentary for 29 years, I thought that was a good start. When I went back to see her 3 months later, I had lost 35 pounds. My doctor was happy. I was thrilled. Shocked, but still thrilled. I'd lost all that weight and hadn't even really stuck to the plan as strictly as I should have. My goal for the following 3-month check-in was to lose 45 pounds. And yeah, it didn't take long for me to figure out that I was going to have to increase my activity and cut a few more things from my diet to accomplish that goal. But by then, it was a personal decision. It was something I wanted to do, instead of something she was telling me that I had to do. One night in September, I went to the grocery store. While I was breaking my brain trying to figure out if Fig Newtons were healthy or not, 2 guys wearing backpacks and carrying gnarly walking sticks walked past me in the aisle. They were thin, bordering on skinny, and there was just something about them. Their energy, their vibe. It was something I couldn't quite figure out that made me think, I want to be like that. Yeah, guys don't do that very often. If we do, we certainly don't tell anybody about it. But I'm admitting it here so you can understand a decision I made that same day. As casually as I could, I asked one of them if they were hiking. They could have been smartasses and laughed at me or been sarcastic. I mean, they were obviously hikers. Not like they seemed to be out playing football or heading to the bar, but they were nice. We talked for a half an hour about all the things they had experienced on the trail. They went on and on about how they would never understand how people could live so close to the Appalachian Trail and never hike it. Never go into the woods and enjoy the beauty and splendor of the mountains. And I shit you not, they use those exact same words to describe the mountains where I live. Beauty and splendor. See, the funny thing is, when they use those words, it didn't detract from them, their masculinity or anything. Now, if you met me and I used the same phrases, you'd look at me crooked. It just wouldn't seem natural coming from me. By the time those men headed for the exit, I was fired up to go hiking. It seemed goofy that I'd never given it serious thought before. I mean, hell, the Appalachian Trail was right in my backyard, practically. I wouldn't even have to drive somewhere to get to it. and that's how I got into hiking at the age of 29. I started out by joining a hiking club, but it wasn't for me. I kept falling behind everyone else, and I hated their constant chatter while we were hiking. I wasn't enjoying the hikes, and I figured it was doing me no good to continue with them. Solo hiking became my thing during the first year. I know it's dangerous to hike alone, but it sure is a hell of a lot more peaceful. And after a few times of finding myself in trouble, I learned how to be safe even though I was alone. I hike places I'm familiar with. I don't camp overnight in the woods, and I never go anywhere without my cell phone. And I know some of you probably believe that there's no cell reception in any part of the Appalachians, but I assure you that is wrong. There are certain places where there is no reception, but where I hike, there is. As I stated, I only hike places I'm familiar with. I've heard my whole life that some people just have to learn things the hard way. Usually, someone in the family was saying that right after I did something they considered stupid. Like the time I fell out of the hayloft and broke my arm, even though I'd been warned not to play up there. Or the time I laid a windshield wiper on the electric fence to see if the rubber part would really protect me from getting shocked. But when it came to the woods, there's one thing I wish I hadn't learned the hard way. I went out one day last year in the early fall, which is my favorite time of the year to hike the mountain right behind my house. It's not one of the bigger mountains in the area, but it is the most beautiful, in my opinion, and there are few people who go up there because of the way the trails ramble and twist. Parts of them are narrow and steep, while the other parts disappear into the bottoms of huge ravines, and it's near impossible to pick them up again on the other side. It's possible to stay only on one side of the mountain for a few days, and never walk over the same ground twice. Now, I left my house that Saturday morning with exactly that intention. The plan was to hit the trail just before sunrise and come out just before sunset. My rucksack was pretty light, just some power bars and water along with my gear for the day. Now, some people say not to go into the Appalachian mountains when it's dark, but I grew up here. They're just mountains to me. We see them, we walk them, and we play in them on a daily basis. So hitting the trail before sunrise was nothing out of the ordinary for me. The woods are peaceful, the air is cool and refreshing, and nothing beats being there to watch the sun come up. Before I was on a little peak where I like to watch sunrise and planned on having my breakfast, the sun was already up. It was a disappointment, but nothing huge. I had my power bar, drank some water, and listened to the forest wake up around me. Birds chirped and called, squirrels barked, and chipmunks skittered through last year's leaves on the ground. The leaves had only started changing colors, but hadn't fallen yet. When the sunlight touched the trees, it was like being inside a fire and looking out at the brilliant yellows, oranges, and deep reds. I inhaled deeply, taking in the smell of fall. And if you know that scent, well, I bet you just smelled it. Memories are powerful, aren't they? That's the beauty, the wonder, and the curse of the human mind. The scent of fall filled me with contentment and a sense of joy that I was sure I would carry with me all day. Crossing the peak where I had breakfast, I went down on the other side. The sun hadn't touched that part of the mountain yet, and it lay in a shadow with a thin fog creeping up from the black soil. The fog dampened sound like each noise was being filtered through a thick wool blanket. Descending into those woods was like descending into a fairy tale set in Germany's Black Forest. I was certain the brothers Grimm had walked through those woods just the same as I was walking that day. The deep, dark shadows and sporadic whirls of fog dancing across their path no doubt kindled their imaginations. Kindled mine, all right. Sometimes a bit too much, and I would spook myself. Shadows stretched and reached down the mountainside, and sometimes I could swear I had seen something unnatural. A witch, a dog man, a ghost, hell, even a werewolf once. Of course, I saw none of those things. They're not real. They're fictions relegated to the prisoners between the covers of books forever and ever. But that knowledge didn't keep my mind from conjuring monsters from shadows and mist. Letting my mind run in whatever direction it wanted, I kept a steady pace down that slope until I reached the bottom. Now, remember what I said about the trail sometimes ending in a huge and deep ravine? That's where I was that day, in the valley of the ravine. Something whistled. It wasn't a calling the dog whistle, it was a very "hey you" whistle. And it came from the dark side of the mountain I had just descended. Instinctively, I turned to look at the spot where I thought the whistle had come from. But there was nobody there, at least not that I could see. I stood on the precipice of worlds in that ravine. I could see the dusky place I just walked through, but if I turned 180 degrees and tilted my eyes up, it was a sunny morning on the other, higher slope. Holding my breath, I stared into the murky darkness for a few more seconds as I listened for any sounds that weren't being made by nature. There were none. The mist rolled up the ravine in big whirls, as if being stirred by the running of a large, swift animal. A horse came to mind, as I had seen horses running through thick fog before in the fields. The only thing was, there was no sound, no horse, no animal at all. Just the rolling, swirling mist. I turned toward the sunny hill and set my sights on a large pine at the top. It was a great place to look out over the smaller mountains and gently sloping hills. And then, the "hey you" whistle came again. There was nothing threatening about the sound, but it sent goosebumps all over me, and I froze for a moment. I had heard no other human movements, but the whistle sounded only a few yards behind me. I jerked my head around, knowing there were no big trees or rocks for whoever was back there to hide behind. Once again, there was nothing but the forest and its animals to be seen or heard. I did note, however, that the spot where the second whistle came from still lay in shadow, and it was getting darker there as the sun rose higher and pushed the shadows down the hill. Turning back to the trail ahead, I told myself it was just a bird. It had sounded the exact same both times. Probably a mockingbird. It is the state bird, and they have been known to imitate the sounds of dogs, frogs, even horns. So it was possible that the mockingbird had heard someone whistling and was imitating the sound. That didn't really calm my nerves much for some reason, though. Any other time I could talk myself right out of being spooked, but not that day. The only thing that seemed to help was when I crested the other side of the ravine and could look out over the vastness of the mountains and the hills. After several hours, I had all but forgotten about the eerie whistling, but as I was heading out, I stopped at the top of a completely different ravine and looked down from the rim. It was dark down there already. Not completely dark, but dark enough to make me pause and remember what had happened that morning. I could man up and just follow the trail that I knew would come out right on the other side of the dip, or I could chicken shit out and follow the ridge, walk 2 miles out of my way, and go down where there was no ravine. That was a no-brainer. I didn't have time to go 2 miles out of my way to get out of the woods the easier way. I'd planned on using the trail in front of me because it would allow me to get out of the woods just before sunset. About 10 steps down the slope, something whistled from inside the gathering darkness at the bottom. I stopped so suddenly that my feet slid out from underneath me, and I started sliding toward the shadows below on my ass. Panicked, I clawed at the ground and tried to dig my heels in, but the bank was steep and I kept sliding. Flipping to my side, I finally got stopped a few feet from the quickly dimming land of twilight ahead. My heart thundered so loud that it drowned out all the other sounds for at least a minute while I gained my footing and turned to go back up the hill I had so gracefully slid down. Once faced with the unnerving darkness, I couldn't force myself to go into it. The wind stirred the half-dead leaves in the trees, rattling them like old dry bones, and I could hear the insinuation of words hiding in the rushing, rattling sounds. "Steve," something whispered underneath the swoosh of wind in the brittle grass. I turned, panting for breath. Sure, I would see some demented serial killer, teeth bared in a bloodthirsty grin and blade in hand, coming for me. But I saw nothing. I could feel a presence lurking just beyond my line of sight, though. I turned and climbed hard with hands and feet. Screw it. I would walk the extra 2 miles if it meant I didn't have to see whatever was down there hiding in the dark. And no, it never dawned on me that I was going to still be in the woods when full dark hit. The only thing I wanted was to go where the dying light of the sun still kissed the mountain. When I reached the trail, which was a wide, gentle trail often referred to as a toddler's trail, I stopped just long enough to catch my breath, and then I set out at a light jog, putting as much distance between me and the ravine as possible. Too tired to run anymore, I slowed to a fast walk, and soon to a slow walk. The sun was almost gone, and that's when I realized I would be on the trail in complete darkness for at least a quarter of a mile. Unshouldering my pack, I reached in for my LED flashlight as I walked. The trail sloped downward ahead, and it was awash in blackness. My name was called again, but it sounded as if it came from miles away. I didn't slow down much, but I did look over my shoulder. Maybe people were camping somewhere and the woman had called for her husband, boyfriend, or son, and they just happened to be named Steve, like me. It's a common enough name. It was possible, but my insides twisted a little bit at the sound of it. With the light pointed in front of me, I went right into the darkness. It was all downhill from that point, and the trail was really wide with no washouts or drop-offs to worry about. I was going to be fine even though night had fallen. Funny thing about these mountains, though, the sun goes down, the world goes dark, and shit happens that you wish you didn't even know about. Something whistled behind me. It was at quite a distance, but it was that "Hey You" whistle, the one where you can almost hear the words being spoken. I swung the beam of light toward the sound and something chuckled even farther away. I tried to run, but a few yards later, my lower back seized up and left me fighting to keep my feet under me as a sharp, debilitating pain ran from my waist down to my ankle. I clicked the button on the flashlight until it was at maximum width and brightness. Something off in the forest to the right of me snickered like a mean-spirited kid who had just pulled a prank. From the left side, that damn chuckle again, and from behind, the whistle. Then something was moving from one tree branch to the other on the right side. With every sound, I swung the bright beam of light in its direction, but never saw anything that shouldn't have been there. The pain eased enough for me to move again, and I walked, Each time my right foot hit the ground, a piercing sharp pain lit up my lower spine, and the chuckling turned into a cackle. A Hollywood version of a witch's laugh, but it sounded very far away. So did the other sounds. Maybe whatever, and I was pretty sure at that point it was a whatever instead of a whoever, was retreating. But the thing's echoing voice yelled my name again. It hollered, making the name long and drawn out. Steve. Less than a quarter of a mile, I told myself, forcing my legs to move faster. I gripped my side and ran my fingers into the painful spot on my back, clenching my teeth, and I swung the light back and forth like Bob Ross swinging that big paintbrush to wash his canvas white. Every few steps, just for good measure, I turned and did the same behind me. I kept hearing the whistle and my name being called, and sometimes the sounds were so close they caused my ass to clench, and other times they sounded miles away. Then I heard the distinct sound of my mother's voice calling for me. She called again, and there was panic in her voice. It was coming from a spot not far from where I was, just down the trail and off to the right side. My instinct was to go to her. How did she know I was there, though? I stopped and swept the light back and forth in the trees where I had heard her voice. She knew all the trails I knew, and she knew the ones I used the most. Maybe. Mom? I yelled. Mom, is that you? Steve, I fell. My ankle. Help me. Before I thought about it, I stepped off the trail into the blackness of the forest. The voice had hit me right in the heart. It could belong to no one else. I'm coming, I said, ducking under the low branches of a maple. Steve, she said. My name turned into a sigh, and I thought she had passed out. The hell's your light, Mom? I swept the area with my light and couldn't see her. Mom? I yelled, hoping to rouse her from unconsciousness as I skirted a large moss-covered rock. When I put my hand against the rock to keep my balance, I immediately recoiled. It felt wrong. Almost like warm leather with a fine coat of short fur. The surface had given under my hand, and it was warm. Not like the warmth left behind from soaking in the sun for part of the day, but the kind of warmth that living, breathing things have. I pushed forward and called for Mom again. Her voice hadn't been that far away. And fearing I had walked by her laying under a bush or in tall weeds, I turned to go back. The beam of my flashlight wasn't directly on the large, mossy rock, and neither was my attention, but from the corner of my eye, I could have sworn the surface of that rock shifted and rippled like liquid. As soon as my light hit it, it was just a mossy rock again. It's just moonlight playing tricks on my eyes, I think, I thought. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew I had to get out of there. My mother wasn't there. There's no way she could have been. And if she had been, how the hell would she have known that the light coming down the trail belonged to me? Yeah, I was so stupid. No, I was beyond stupid to fall for the trick, considering how many times I had heard laughing and whistling while I was on that trail. But you see, in the back of my mind, doubt needled me. What if those sounds were men? What if they attacked dear old Mom and left her for dead? You really gonna leave without being sure? And yep, that's exactly what I was doing, because it was impossible for her to really be there. Just as I reached the edge of the trail, something wrapped around my ankle and yanked backwards. My light flew from my hand, spun in the air, and then fell into the overgrowth. It had taken me a good 5 minutes to walk from that mossy rock back to the edge of the trail, but I was back at the mossy rock in 3 seconds flat. My pack was gone and my whole front side felt shredded up. "Steve?" Mom's voice was at my foot. Rolling over, I didn't see my mother. I didn't see anything I recognized. The mossy rock surface was rippling and shimmering, and it had nothing to do with the moonlight. It chuckled, and I could just make out the curving line of a mouth as the thing unfolded and straightened up into a thin, pale, human-like shape. I screamed, but there was no sound. Scrambling, I clawed at the ground, ripped stones and saplings from dirt, and kicked out whatever was still around my ankle. I was raised and then slammed into the ground on my back. The tall, thin gray thing leaned close and grinned. Its maw was filled with thin, jagged, sharp rock teeth, and the eyes were burning yellow coals. The stench of death rushed from its mouth and gagged me. I tried to scream again, and there was no sound. My throat was too tight to let any sound out. The thing leaned down, put its face a few inches from mine, opened its mouth wide, and my scream came out of it. Then it gnashed its teeth together. Shards of broken rock rained down on me. Suddenly, I was flying through the pitch-black forest with only slivers of moonlight piercing the canopy. The thing had taken to the trees. Its long, skinny arms and legs stretched out and retracted rhythmically, pulling us silently along except for the whooshing of air and the rustling of leaves. Then we stopped, and the ground was underneath me again. I struggled, but the thing's grip on my ankle was like a shackle. It just walked and dragged me behind it. Every now and then, a laugh would bubble up from deep inside the monster, but died before coming to full fruition. I was going to die in an unimaginable way at the hands of whatever the thing was. The trees thinned out, and we were in the open. I could see the sky again, and part of me wishes the moon had been fuller, and the other part is damn glad that it wasn't. But I could see that we were walking towards an ivy-covered structure that looked like a big abandoned barn, and that's when I began to consider my escape. Barns hold a plethora of farm tools. Even long abandoned ones usually had the odd pitchfork, pickaxe, shovel, hell, something I could defend myself with if I could only get my hands on it. The side of the barn facing the field was almost completely open. Time and weather had rotted away most of the planks. The monster crossed the threshold, and I was looking around frantically for anything I could grab. Oh, and I did see all the tools I just mentioned. Those and many more, plus a rusted old tractor that looked like it was straight from the 1950s. But I couldn't reach any of them. The thing's empty hands reached up, the arms stretched out impossibly long, and the hooked fingers grasped a pole in the loft, and a second later, I thumped down in a hayloft. Then I was being dragged across the floor to the opening at the side. I thought it was going to hurl me out of the opening, but it didn't. Instead, it made a sound that was a mix between the call of a raven and the crow of a rooster. It was bragging about its latest catch. While it bragged, my eyes had fallen on a hayrake that was only 3 feet away and buried underneath a scattering of old hay and bird feathers. I stretched toward it, hooking my fingers between the floorboards and willing my arm to be just a little longer. The awkward position of my body wouldn't allow me to easily reach the only weapon in sight, but that didn't stop me from trying. It was life or death, and I knew it, so I kept inching my fingers towards it. When the monster stepped back from the opening, my hand closed around the handle of the rake, and I dragged it to me, flipping the business end towards the middle of the monster's back, and then I paused. It had been a stone in the forest. Would the rake's teeth even penetrate it? And if they did, would they kill it? Hit a heart that I wasn't even sure was there? The hold around my ankle disappeared, and the monster's back became its front. It pinned me with those horrible yellow eyes and grinned. I clutched the rake as I stared at those eyes. They were gelatinous, viscous fire burning deep in the thing's head. They were soft. I plunged the rake forward into the thing's eyes. There was a sickening crunch, and then all resistance stopped. The teeth of the rake sank quickly through something the size of a basketball and the consistency of thick mud. I don't know whose scream was louder. I was disgusted and worse than terrified. Every instinct I had told me to run, but I couldn't leave until I knew the thing was dead. I stood and shoved until the monster backed into the wall, and I kept pushing until the teeth of the rake pierced the wood behind its head. Then I jumped into the old tractor, tumbled to the dirt, and I ran. It felt like I ran for hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes before I cleared the field and the little stand of trees beyond it. There was a gravel road. I turned left and ran until I reached the paved road at the end. After another 15 minutes, I recognized the road, and I knew just how far that thing had taken me. Nearly 20 miles from the trail I had been on earlier. Now I was lucky, even though it really sounds like I wasn't. I got away. I lived to tell the tale, and I'm sure there aren't many of us out there who have done that. You see, what I learned after the incident was what that thing was. Or is. I don't know if they could die or not. Not the way we think of death anyway. But I learned it's called a mountain mimic. One of the scariest damn things I've ever heard of, too. They can imitate rocks, trees, buildings, animals, and almost anything. The one person I told the truth of this experience to also told me why the old rake was probably one of the best weapons I could have grabbed. Its teeth were made of iron, and everybody knows that supernatural creatures can be wounded or killed with iron or silver. Given the lack of silver in old barns, I was extremely lucky. He also told me that if I had not acknowledged the laughs, whistles, and my name being called, the thing would have left me alone. People had always said that if you hear something whistle in the woods, no, you didn't. And if you hear your name being called in the forest, hell no, you didn't. I never thought a whit about that. We hear all kinds of old wives' tales, legends, and scary stories growing up. But trust me, if you ever hear something whistle or call your name in the forest, no, you didn't. And just to be on the safe side, maybe carry plenty of things made of iron or silver with you when you go into the mountains.